problems really are generated by society. What people seek out, whatever sexual customs they seek out, cannot be legislated because they evolved in this kind of society. And so if you went to India or took a book like the Kama Sutra, which was not considered pornography, which is a term assigned to customs which we are unfamiliar. So if you really re-examine the situation and you want to deal with problems of that kind, you have to start from a different premise. And here's how you go about it. Let's assume we were going to deal with a very well-built aircraft to be entered into air races. The optimal fuel can be specified for that airplane under those conditions. The abilities of the pilot, his background and flying experience, can also be equated with his ability to perform in that particular situation. The lubrication oil for the bearings vary, the kind of lubrication you use in different portions of the aircraft. All of those things can be identified because you know what it is that you want of that car. You know that you want it to perform a certain way. Military aircraft have wing flaps, ailerons of a given size. Aircraft carriers have arresting gear to stop aircraft landing at sea. These are high-speed military aircraft. If the aircraft were to miss, if the arresting hook wouldn't drop in the back of the aircraft, they'd have to fly around again and try to land again. The aircraft are designed for a specific task. The deck is designed for particular reasons. They have firefighting equipment. In other words, what they have on that deck is to handle all known contingencies, including a loose bomb. They have all kinds of things laid out. But the main problem in any given society is not pornography or crime. The main problem is to identify what kind of society you want, what kind of behavior is optimal, what it is and where it is that we wish to go. And if you can do that, if anyone is capable of doing that or any group is capable of doing that, the next portion of the problem is to design an environment to generate the kind of patterns that we would consider desirable. Immediately when that kind of statement is made, people raise the question, well, what authority or what group can possibly get up and identify the desirable patterns? And what is desirable to one group may not be desirable to another group. And if we can't get together in that area, we will have all the sexual deviations. Now, I'm not advocating that this pattern of sexual behavior or the other pattern or any other system in sexual behavior is desirable. What is desirable is that humans, as living organisms, undergo physiological performance characteristics. Only a systems approach to human performance. If we were to determine by methods of physiological research, I'm not saying that this is so, that kissing, as we do mouth to mouth, may be a main source of infection of a given kind. Perhaps the custom of kissing might be modified in the future. You're not about to get out and advocate that people no longer kiss or swap tongues. It may be that in the future this may be determined as undesirable. Undesirable in terms of physical health. So the future might tend to generate, through motion pictures, just as kissing has been introduced in the environment by a pre-structured society. Whether you lick the nose, ear, or oral cavity, or vagina, or fellatio, or whatever sexual indulgence you may engage in, there may be patterns of sexual indulgence that are healthier for human beings. And if that is determined, then those patterns in the future will be encouraged. In the early days of Iceland, they kind of touched noses, and this turned them on, whereby they couldn't consider it, or oral kissing. And so perhaps in the future, some kind of studies will be made as to what the optimal performance may be for a human being, whatever that may be, and that will be encouraged. In other words, if people were encouraged to go to motion pictures in which they were to observe how war was conducted, where they would shoot flamethrowers at retreating soldiers, and you'd have the burning bodies of soldiers, or whether or not you run motion pictures in which the ghoul would dig up a grave and consume the bodies, or whether or not a mad scientist would cut up a human body, remove the bowels, which they do in many motion pictures, and many children are permitted to see those motion pictures, as well as adults. Just what is it that we wish to attain in our society? What kind of end goals do we want? In an open society, I would say that pornography would be no more dangerous than the teachings of the church. which in turn produce a set of values that make it almost impossible for people to live together and genuinely relate to one another without inhibition. I would say the church may be responsible. Many of our newspaper publications, they write articles and degrade human beings. They mention the names of children that have committed crimes, which in turn hurt their brothers and sisters in school. Well, just exactly what is socially offensive has to be determined by some kind of studies, and some kind of studies directed toward some kind of specified end goal. Does anyone know what I mean by that? You can't achieve a high-speed boat unless you know that the boat is going to move at a given speed and what the general wave conditions might be and what the optimal speed is that you hope to attain. And therefore the hull and the power systems and the distribution of the engine in that car, the contours of the front of the boat have to coincide with the expected performance chart. Now this is done in the building of a railway system. If the train is to move at 200 or 300 miles an hour, all of the curves have to be calculated so as to generate the maximum safety for a train moving at that speed around a bend. Now the question sometimes is brought up, well, can you do that with human beings? Can you regulate and measure what it is that humans ought to do? And who is going to do that measuring? If you cannot bring society together, members of society, and agree upon some kind of desirable end goal, free of moral judgments and religious implications, some kind of functional morality. That means no air contamination, anything, loud noises that may be detrimental to hearing mechanisms in humans, a certain optimal level of air cleanliness and water pollution controls. I'm talking about the kind of controls that actually affect the physiological condition of man. So in that sense, I think that a system of environmental management, I'd rather use that word than controls, because controls seem to bother a great many people. But when we can work out a system of environmental management that includes statistical studies that are determined or based upon statistical studies and altered in relation to the measurements and the performance that comes out of new experimental environments. In other words, when you propose that a certain system in education be used, and if it is used, you still have to measure the end product produced by that environment. And then again, modify your educational systems so that you can attain the end goal. Will that interfere with creativity and originality? Well, without a clear definition of creativity and originality, you run into other obstacles. For example, I think it'd be very original for a pickpocket to wear artificial hands holding a newspaper and pick the pockets with his active hands behind him. You remove things from a department store counter. Now that's originality, but that would be called perhaps by some people immoral or negative originality. The decision on positive or negative originality generates another problem in our present culture. Would the teaching of evolution be a threat in some areas of the United States today? Many people think so. Would the teachings of many, or the advocacy of atheists and social reformers be a good idea? Well, there'd be many people who would be against that, perhaps some few for it. Just what is good for human beings is a very difficult thing to decide, because most people are not qualified in the science of decision-making. Now, the difference between the science of decision-making and a lot of people sitting at a round table trying to evaluate what's best for human beings is most probably based upon their own set of values and their own preferences. So I would imagine that at a later date, when this problem becomes dominant or overwhelming, which it is becoming, and at that time, they're either going to have to increase the size of the police force and the monitors or Big Brother, and all they're going to do is drive pornography underground, where it's always been. It has always been with us. We're not about to change it by legislation. In fact, many of our congressmen and senators live a pornographic life. In fact, most people do. We're probably all here as a result of some kind of private pornographic action. And so I would say that if we wish to change human behavior, we really have to do a hell of a lot of work and find out what might be optimal for humans living in a communal arrangement. Now, In order to do that, you're not going to be able to accomplish it by seminars. What you're going to have to do is work with the second generation, or a group of students or children in the schools. And they would be brought up with a set of values that are strictly referential. That is, behavior is related to events in the physical world. There'd be a high degree of scientific orientation and a high degree of cross-cultural studies to arrive at the optimal performance for human beings. And that would also apply to shoes. We wouldn't permit a designer or a stylist to prepare a set of shoes for man in the future. We would probably have a group of physiologists design the shoes based upon the way we walk, our weight distribution, the way our feet move, the kind of walking habits that we have established. When the shoes are based upon the physiological requirements of the individual wearing the shoes, you're more apt to come up with a comfortable set of shoes. Now, some people raise the question, well, what if they look like clods? Well, it probably doesn't occur to those people that the shoes that you have available, that you pick today, are really the result of the kind of propaganda and advertising regarding the kind of shoes you want to wear. But if at some time in the future shoes have an entirely different appearance, we would become accustomed to those shoes and wear them. Perhaps you rarely see a person wearing a sun helmet in New York City. Rarely. That is a pith helmet. Whereas in Africa at a certain time, it might be the thing to do. So what we do before we go to Africa, we usually read books about it, and we acquire the boots and the hunter's jacket, and the necessary equipment, including a net if we're going to mosquito-infested areas. We bring with us the kind of equipment that will enable us to survive in those areas. The same kind of thing applies to industry. If they wish to build airplanes or automobiles or ships or plastic car bodies, they have to do studies on the flexibility of the materials, the safety of the materials, the probability of the emissions from those materials in case of a fire on the highway, whether certain plastic coverings over seats might be detrimental in airplanes or automobiles or ships. But we have to do studies on almost everything we do. And the same would apply to sex. Not a committee meeting, not discussions on radio and television, but actually statistical studies regarding the range of human behavior and also what might tend to preserve the human organism as a species in the healthiest relationship, because a human must relate with other humans, and therefore the studies have to be related to that. However, the people that are already conditioned, you're not about to get up and restructure society's sexual patterns by legislation or law. Again, you only drive it underground. Are there any questions regarding any of these problems? Rather than say who will make these decisions or what group of people will make such decisions, or who can be so presumptuous as to assume that they know precisely what to do, I don't think that anybody knows precisely what to do, but I think we can safely say that there are certain human patterns of behavior that would be more desirable from a functional point of view, not necessarily an ethical or moral point of view. And perhaps functional ethics may be the future of morality. So much for that. Now, is there anybody who wants to discussing? What's that? Oh, yes. I think that that in essence is...
Whatever is coming through, I want to turn it on.
Well, I'll turn it on again, but I just want to know whether or not there are any areas in that you didn't understand. Anybody have any difficulties with that? As to what has to be done? Suppose I were to repeat the question to you. We can put it on tape, I think.
Oh.
Well, I hope we can have a cross discussion on tape. Is that mic on now? Like it? You may have to spin it back to see where it...
No, that's all right.
Okay, all right.
Go ahead.
Okay, with the sound volume and all that had been preset. And so we come back to the conditions that we call optimal. What kind of problems do you foresee in such a proposal? Anybody recognize any possible problems in such a proposal?
And what proposal?
The proposal of restructuring sexual behavior in a new generation, but we've got to allow, not necessarily allow, we've got to understand that whatever patterns have been generated by this culture is the result of culture. And you're not about to legislate it out of existence any more than you can legislate various religions out of existence, or our habits which we have acquired over many years. You can diminish some of the habits, as I said before, but you're not about to legislate them out of existence.
Well, the problem really is that unless society changes in some way, all this talk doesn't mean too much, because you can't vary our ideas of pornography or sex unless certain other attitudes change.
I don't think so. I think you're right. I don't think you can possibly sell pictures of nude women in the South Seas many years ago because it was commonplace. And I think that if you understand the real meaning of the problem, which is really not pornography, it's patterns of behavior that we're dealing with. Some patterns are considered more desirable, others are considered less desirable by people of a particular persuasion. Yes.
Doesn't the whole concept of pornography rise about the concept of scarcity and physical not being able to have certain biological needs met?
I would say
in a given society?
that's so, yes.
And then structure it to an understanding of biological needs. Would this be part of the problem and to alleviating it and posing an alternative to it?
Well, instead of proposing an alternative to it, what we have to do is test the alternatives, put them to test.
It also has to do with configuration of prejudice in pornography, in a sense.
Yes, it does.
Because you do emphasize, if you shoot a picture of a pretty-looking girl or a guy, whatever you do, and you print that.
I think your statement there is probably pornography is a question of geography.
No, pornography is not only a nude body.
It's
It's
not
more
just
What
than
other
nude
types of
body.
pornography do you see?
You know,
No, it's I don't think people so much say pornography nowadays is a nude body. It's what it's being done, like the sadism with it, or different expressions within sexual behavior. It's not just a nude body. It's how it's being done, like sodomy and this is the issue with the Hustler magazine, because they're not just showing you like Playboy a nude body to look at. It's an attitude.
You know,
It's an
people with
attitude
human excrement on their bodies.
somebody-
Would you say then there's a
Well, like-
limit?
No, I'm not saying it's a limit. But when you talk about pornography, that like in the South Seas, they would never look at a body, but there's still a certain attitude towards sex. Now, a culture creates a certain attitude towards sex, so there's accidental attitudes towards sex. Like, let's for example, that kid that gets off by burning a house because of the fire, or his mother hitting him while she was dressed in the riding boots, that kind of a conditioning.
So there are inhibited.
Okay, but that is also,
Yes.
this is what people consider pornography, whether or not we would call it that. But I don't think it's so much the nude body anymore that's considered pornography, but the whole sexual expression.
Well, I think
That
it
they
has
think
also to
should
do
be
with the
confined
religious
to.
values that you have about guilt about sex that you are taught.
I mean, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about
What are you trying to say?
When I'm,
Think that.
it is something that you cannot say no more laws of showing a nude body. It's a need for expression, a certain kind of a background, an accidental conditioning, so that would have to be controlled. Let's say we could all be brought up nude and not look at a body, but I could accidentally be conditioned to some, let's say, abnormal to that group kind of a pattern, sexual pattern, which I need maybe a certain kind of the expression of it.
What do you advocate that we do?
Which we have in the society.
But that's
in certain areas, we do have a wide range of different sexual
What do you
patterns
suggest we
because
do?
of that. Well,
We have
you
these
cannot say that it should not be allowed as long as nobody's
Well,
been
how do you
hurt.
want to
But
handle these deviations?
If environment is more controlled than it is today, there's less likelihood of that.
When you use the word control, do you mean some sort of committee up there making decisions about our sexual patterns?
No, certainly
What do you
not.
mean by control?
No, control is that, well, first of all, a certain education towards sex.
What
that
kind of
people-
education towards sex? The old morality? The
No
newer
morality.
morality?
No morality. What do you mean by new morality in sex?
Well,
I mean,
the customs that seem to be prevalent today.
well, if you don't put any emphasis on it, but it's just being expressed in whatever way or form, let's say people.
Well, let me ask you a question which I'm not sure of. How would you handle, should children at 10 or 11 or 9 begin to engage in sex? Where do you begin? On what day do you begin sexual activity?
Well, I wouldn't legislate
Whenever
that
the
at all. I mean,
curiosity
whenever it happens,
rises
it
within a
happens.
child, let that child go ahead and explore and
Exactly.
experiment.
What about the
without
consequences
interfering.
of pregnancy and the inability to assume the responsibility of that condition?
Well, what is...
Well, but if kids are brought
Well,
up like
yeah, I
no,
am-
but
yeah.
in Germany nowadays they start sex education with 9 and 10 years old. They know all about the methods
First of all, there is also- there
birth
is-
control, and they know what to do.
Are you saying that 9-year-olds and 10-year-olds, or what if an 18-year-old wanted to engage in sexual relations with a 9-year-old? Are you going to have any kind of law, or are you just going to let it go wherever it goes?
No, I think if you
These are the
structure,
questions that people are asking today.
If you structure a society that we arrive, okay, we say this a particular sexual behavior for men is, let's say, more optimal than others. Let's say in terms of kissing, okay? If we say that, and we push that through movies, through literature, and so on, but we have no values in regards to good or bad sexual behaviors. In other words, if there is an accidental conditioning in another part, we don't look at this type of behavior as bad behavior or deviant behavior, but we try to deal with it.
Well,
Okay?
how would you deal with the children problem? I don't know. Say a 17-year-old wanted a 9-year-old girl. How would you deal with that?
Does the girl want it?
Ah,
Would she physically
let's
be
assume that
capable?
he's
That
able
she's
to seduce
underdeveloped,
her.
she couldn't.
He's able to seduce the girl.
Well,
But
there would
listen,
be no
can-
seductive behavior in the future, would there be?
Well, I don't know.
You
What do
have a
what do
different
have to say?
conditioning. Why,
Yeah, but
why
look-
would he go for her?
What do you have to
This,
say? about
this
that?
is an argument in a circle. Everybody, even in the most, what we call freest societies, conditioned one way or the other. I mean, it's not everything goes, there's never such a thing. I mean, they always have to set up some
And-
kind
and
of...
You want to put a limit on
Well,
where-
because again, even with our
Okay.
famous committee here, they're going to say the seduction of a 9-year-old girl by an 18-year-old generally proves disastrous and the consequences extremely negative, et cetera, et cetera, et
There's
cetera.
much
They're gonna
evidence
find-
in the Bible that many people have taken wives that were 12 years old.
Can I-
That's
Well,
just like
12 ain't
India,
bad.
married
I'm not
for 12
advocating
years
that.
old.
12 is not too
Can I
bad.
say
Hey, you
something?
said
Can I
9.
say something?
Yes.
Because your question is related actually to
Yeah.
something else. The way I pick it up, in a sense of you are singling out sex. If we are pushing sex as not as a product as such, as where you arrive an orgasm to, but sex between people that relate. In other words, in the future, I can't see that people would want to fuck a 9-year-old girl because they
Right.
wouldn't have anything to say to the girl.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Okay.
And so on. I
And
think
you
it has to
feel
do with
that
the
people
total.
that have such needs are, from your point of view, somewhat distorted socially because they can't have a sharing relationship.
But it has to do with the total cultural situation right now. This is why you have these deviations.
Would you enact laws now to prevent that from occurring?
I don't think it's a question of laws. I think laws, to me, I think you mentioned it once before, imply systems that have not really been worked out. And I think,
But
Well, what
now
do you
we're-
recommend for the present? Now, you had something you want to say, Alex, regarding that. Did you?
No, this whole thing about sex is so damn rational, as if a guy says, gosh, I'd really like to talk to that 9-year-old, but she hasn't got a brain in her head. I think I'll go scooch Maria over here. People don't do that. They get excited. There's a 9-year-old girl. Any guy that's got it figured out in his head is screwed up worse than a 9-year-old girl. I mean, that guy is crazy. And most men, like it's in the Bible, that's why they make laws for that. In Greece, in 100 years ago, you couldn't even see your own daughter when she was 9 years old. For fear you'd rape your own daughter. In most countries, it was that way. I mean, any guy that figures that out has got his head up his ass. You're telling me that's going to be the future? If the future is that way, we got no worries. Everybody is so crazy, we're in great shape.
What do you have to say, John? You want to make a comment?
Guy's going to sit there and figure it out.
Joe?
I mean-
We were talking about what we might consider a permissible range of sexual behavior. How much freedom should there be in sexual behavior? Just where do you draw the lines? Does a 10-year-old molest a 5-year-old? Does a 17-year-old molest a 5-year-old? How do you
Well,
work?
there's less likelihood of anybody under 9-year-old being motivated to any sexual, other than looking and exploring and something, to actually go about and having any kind
So
of...
I say a
It depends on the-
17-year-old. Yes.
17-year-olds, it's quite different. Even from 12 on, it's quite different than under anything below 10.
All right.
But
That's
I
fine.
mean, if we talk about the future or about the present, it always depends. But
Yeah.
it certainly would be hopeful in the future that.
And you
there
feel
will
that the
be-
future could phase that out, that problem?
Yeah.
Okay, what do you think, Joe?
Do you think that there's some relationship between interest in sex, I mean intense enough interest in sex to where people would be doing it like every night, also relative to how much information they've got about the world around them, how educated are they?
Well, sex is not usually related to education. It's related to another aspect, your sex
Well,
drive.
first of
Which,
all-
and also the kind of specific conditions, and you have, related to sex. There are many well-educated people that are child molesters or homosexuals. I'm not putting it down, lesbians, or whatever. But I'm not putting these things down. What I'm saying is that education has nothing to do with sexual behavior. Unless you're talking about education and sex.
Well, no.
Are you talking about sexual education? Or are you talking about
No, not that
education
at
in general?
all. What would happen with today's civilization, that the kids that are 9 years old are really brainless human beings. They have no goal, no aspirations, most of them.
Were they ever anything else to you?
Oh, at one time they were.
You would say that children were brighter in the past?
Well, as I perceived them, sure. I really didn't pay too much attention to it at all, but I would imagine that I wouldn't have had the same perspective of children that I had at this stage.
Well, maybe you forget, because when you were a kid, you didn't have the set or the point of view to look around at the youngsters you played with, but their values, I'm sure, were probably somewhat less adequate and more confused in the past. Although there may have been surface morality, but a lot of it was submerged.
Oh, wait a minute. What I mean is that the value system of the general American child, on the average, was probably like mine. I was probably like them. Probably. Because I remember all the bullshit programs I used to watch when I was 9, 10 years old. I don't think I'm that different back then. But as I look at today's youth, it's probably the same as it was 15, 20 years ago.
Well, what do you think we ought to do? We're talking about what we might do regarding some of the problems that are dominant today.
Well, we really couldn't do anything. I mean, whatever happens is going to happen in a price system.
All right, you don't feel there's anything that you can do within the context of this?
No. Well, what changed our attitude towards sex was the automobile. The fact that everybody got out and was making it in the backseat of a car. I mean, the society
That
moves
was
in a
good
certain way.
advertising.
There's a backseat
That
of a
was good
barn, too.
advertising.
Or a backseat of a barn. Well, the
They had
barn.
it.
Well, the barn, they did a lot of things on farms. And then the car came along, maybe the
I don't think it was
airplane.
the rumble seat, yeah.
It seems as if the major problem lies within the family unit, the
Sure,
structure.
exactly. If we can
And this
explain.
here is due to perpetuation of values that each of us have grown up in a family unit and hand that on because of the early conditioning process, is that it may be within the given society, if an experiment could be arranged, where there's a gradual easing away from the family unit, and as you have proposed before, is to go ahead and have a facility where children can be reared by people who love and can work and educate with children. Then
Wouldn't
it
they
may be a beginning
superimpose their
basis.
values
Yes, they
upon the
would,
children?
but I think if they were intelligent enough, is that they would probably not interfere to a certain degree, as long as the children did not wind up harming each other and abusing each other, either verbally or physically, then they may go ahead and allow a specific range of behavior without interfering with that behavior. But there would be limits to that behavior once it reached a certain phase. This is the thing.
As I understand you, in other words, the shape of the new environment will probably determine the range of sexual behavior.
I would say so,
Yeah.
yes.
Is there anyone that takes an opposite point of view, or that disagrees with that? Or any other questions about it?
And also,
Yeah.
I think as we discuss sex, even I think within us, we're always discussing sex as something very different and very special, not just
Very
something
good, I agree.
that people just do. It is something really, if it comes down to it, something like eating something that you enjoy.
Well, your
Doing
question is,
something
why
that
do you
want to
single
do.
out
Why do
the
we
single
say it is
aspect?
so bad if a 9-year-old and a 5-year-old engage in sex or anything that's pleasurable? Because it is something, because we always have still this biblical thing, with the religion brought up, that sex is something that is confined to a certain thing that is different and special. It's
You
not
want to
part
study
of life.
behavioral problems in any
So
area.
sex, what is really sex?
You don't want to limit it to sex. Is that what you mean?
No,
We're talking about an
think
aspect of behavior
we're
that's singled
taking
out.
something out of life, out of what we do, and say this is sex, and we're still saying it is something to be discussed and different. Something that is not that you just don't talk about. Like
What do you do if you get in a conventional discussion when somebody says, well, we're talking about sex tonight, what are you bringing up something else for?
Well, I'm not
don't-
saying that, but
yeah.
sex
Because
still has
those other
a...
areas are related, because of the
Well, I agree with
interrelatedness
that.
Right.
of everything that encompasses a human being within a given environment. You can't single out one specific area of behavior, since it has to do with hormonal changes.
Well, just so I don't misunderstand you, John, what would you do in such cases where people get together and their sexual preferences, they say they're married, but their sexual preferences vary, the frequency varies. How would you go about handling such problems in the new setup that you're talking about?
Well, in the new setup, is that, okay,
Oh,
to
okay.
me,
Yes, Steve?
the values that would be generated within a new structure, a new societal structure, is that the other people would be aware of the differences, and there would be no jealousy, no clinging to another person if there are needs that this other person cannot fulfill, is that they would want the other person to go and communicate with somebody else also.
And you
on
honestly
another
don't
front.
believe that they'll have a feeling of rejection?
No. No,
Doesn't
they
that seem that behavior has been with us, like, say, for thousands of years? People, I no longer have those feelings. Why doesn't that
It's
occur?
very difficult to break those patterns that have been already, let's say, run through the cortex.
You feel you've been programmed.
They're very deeply ingrained.
Do you feel that
Especially
that
at a very
programming
impressionable
can
age.
ever be eased?
Yes, it can be eased, but I don't believe that to a certain degree it can be completely eliminated as long as you live in an environment where those values are still dominant,
I see.
where the distorted values are still dominant.
Mhm.
And this is the thing. As long as you live in that type of environment, we'll be subject to distortion
Okay.
until the day
What
we
do you have
die.
to say, Joe? You had your hand up regarding that
No,
subject.
it was about something about that.
Is it related to this general subject? You want to say
Well,
something?
these things always change on demand. I'm just thinking rage or jealousy. I mean, yeah, I meet so many women who have been divorced 3 times. I feel enormously insecure. I either accept that and go out with them, or I don't accept it. And most men and most women are accepting it. They say, well, that guy's got 8 kids, he's been married. They accept that. 100 years ago, it was a catastrophic psychological moment. You got to accept it. 50% of the people in this country are divorced. 8 will be 80, it'll be 100%. You got to accept it, or you get out of the system.
Well, that's-
And, but it'll be demand. In other words, they're co-educational, in schools now, the co-educational dormitories. It was on demand. All the kids were living off campus and making it with each other. So the people at the schools, not being humanistic or trying to be helpful, they said, look, nobody's living in the dormitories. We're running out of money. We either do it their way or we don't get the kids to live here. They weren't. They were all getting an apartment in town, with each other. That's how it. The kids demanded it. Nobody's going to do you any favors unless there's some demand. As soon as you notice the budget money going down, the people aren't coming to your school. They say, let's make it interesting for the kids. And if they say put 2 opposite sexes together on their freshman year as a super date, they'll do that to make them come for the money, not because they much care one way or the other.
And the other view?
I think it's on demand. On
Joe?
demand.
That's what I wanted to bring up a little while ago. That very idea of education or information relative to the amount of fucking that these kids are going to be involved in. Because probably, I'm not sure, but in the future, sex will be an interference.
All sex?
Probably.
Anybody agree with that?
No,
Most
I don't
women,
agree.
I think in the future it'll be almost the whole thing.
No,
Most
I
people
think
won't
that
do
would
anything
be-
else.
I think sex would be greatly
The way
diminished.
things are going today.
Yeah, I think that. I think.
Why should it be greatly diminished in the
Because
future?
it's no emphasis put on it anymore. Today, everything is sex, 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 sex. You haven't gotten it, you didn't get laid 3 times a week, you're nobody. In the future.
I think it's
That's
very interesting that you don't
true.
know a lot
They
of
ask you
talk.
how many times a night,
Who
what
asks me?
size, what shape, what...
Nobody's asked me any questions in
Oh, come
years.
on.
No,
That's
there's a
true.
lot of talk, but there's no
Come
real
on.
sexual
Everywhere
activity.
you look, it's sex. If you
Where?
don't make it, if you don't make it, oh, come out.
Very little
It's
going
true.
on. A lot of
Alex,
talk.
Oh,
Alex,
God.
Alex is correct in the respect
Lot of
that
talk.
most sexual occurrences have occurred where we read about it. We have not seen
Well, you
the
might
actual
do it over
behavior.
there.
Are you involved with any groups that you know of who are involved in strictly
Yeah.
sexual behavior and nothing
There's
else?
nobody's, no, I'm not saying strictly
I
sexual,
know, no
but John,
group.
if you done, in every group,
What
how
group?
many girls have you had, how many guys
No,
have you had?
I've never-
Of course,
no.
go to school and talk to the students. I mean, I go to school, I talk with them about it.
I'm going to the
It
wrong
is,
place.
a girl, if she doesn't go out to date, even if it's a shabby little old guy, and she...
What's
she-
it?
But what, hey, what is the
I'm not
problem
talking
anyway?
about the
What is
problem.
this problem that we
It's
have?
artificial.
What is
There's
the
very
problem?
little sex.
What is it that people are so confused about? Why are
It
they
was something
even
that was
talking about it?
artificially deprived and it was played out, and if it's going to be a part of life without emphasis or anything, it's going to be diminished, but it will come more natural, with less distortion than we have today, because of the play.
But then
You
I think
feel,
it'd be more
you
real
feel
activity.
that a human being kissing a dog's anus should be discouraged.
Oh, wait.
Yes, I
Now, you also feel, as I understand it, do you feel that a human being
No, I
kissing...
wasn't saying about anything about discourage anybody. I'm saying if there's no emphasis put on it, if I don't say, sex is something you have to do so many times a
Well, just so that I understand you better, how do you feel about a person kissing a welded symbol shaped like a cross
Well, how do I feel
that
about it?
hundreds of other people kiss
Right. Pretty
as a
bad.
disease contamination section?
Well, I would not say there should be a law to abolish it. I think it should be phased out to educating people how to do it, because the law wouldn't help. A law would probably do the same thing that it does to other people. Go
Well, how do you feel about
underground
shaking hands? I read an article where they indicated that you'd better not shake hands with your doctor
Right.
because they touch so many different people and it's difficult to keep the bacteria count down. Now, just exactly what we ought to show in motion pictures or on television is always a problem generator. Always generate problem at present. In our culture and in the earlier aspects of many cultures, there are some cultures that are not as rigid as our cultures regarding sexual behavior. But the real problem, very few people come into the real problem, as some of you people have stated here, it's a matter of culture, it's a matter of cultural emphasis. And you feel if you de-emphasize or cut down the amount of propaganda regarding desirable sexual patterns of behavior or desirable sexual attitudes or configurations, preferential configuration of humans, what about what they call the natural physiological urge? You haven't talked much about that. Does that interfere? Are you going to interfere with that? Is there a natural physiological urge for expression? Is the expression, it must be sexual in nature, or is it sexual in nature? What about the natural physiological expression? This is the question I'm asking. What are you going to do with that? Who is to say which way we're to direct it?
I don't really think that there is such necessary thing as a natural physiological expression in terms of sexual behavior, because we are talking basically about emphasized behavior that has been reinforced by different circumstances over long periods of time. I think if you don't put that much emphasis on sexual behavior...
Oh, I'm talking about the glands. Here we have glands. You remove the testicles of a bull and it's docile and easygoing. Here you have aggression. Is aggression in the male a product of internal secretion? Or is it a product of environment? What is it? Yes.
They're going to start doing what they did in the military. I know this is what's going to happen next. They're going to put saltpeter or some depressant in the foods, as indeed the additives are. Like there's some enormous sexual urge now. The foods, the additives, all this crap has pulled all this stuff way down. How can most people stand next to each other almost all day long and not even heavy breathe much? That we're being pulled way down already, and they'll increase that. That's my prediction.
You feel through chemical control?
They will, yes.
Yeah.
It's already being done. The
Look-
foods
look at people.
are all chemical. You can't get excited if you try,
But
but
look
most
at
times.
this.
At least I can.
Oh, revelation.
But look at
No,
people
really.
that have different motivations. Like say, for example, monks, or people that really are into
We
it.
can't talk about
No,
that.
no, I'm not talking about it. I'm not talking about the other thing. But a lot of people go for years without sex, and they don't really miss it, because there's other things that they're occupied with.
But they're all monks. They're not with
If
women.
boy,
your
you call
sexual,
it
if your sexual
sublimation.
drive actually decreases, the less you do it.
That's true.
The less you do it, the less decreases. There's not that much urge. So how much urge is there to begin with? Unless it is triggered maybe through some
What
environmental...
about just plain natural sexual expression?
What's the natural?
You're
If you don't know how to do it,
You're gonna have to work on it all,
Monkeys never
sure.
seen how to do it. He never knew how to do it. Remember that case? There were two monkeys in the zoo. They had never seen sexual behavior, and when they put a male and female together, they did not know what to do. They had to give them a movie to instruct them of how to copulate.
It seems as if the whole process is a copying process.
Yes,
No,
exactly.
where with animals, I know that the complexity between the organisms is much different between an animal and a human being. But with animals, when they get together, also it's a copying process. They observe by being immersed with others of their kind, and then they go ahead, and there are certain physiological reactions that occur. But is it due to hormonal? Is it due to environmental influences that impinge upon it?
Well, who do you feel ought to make such decisions as to what patterns might be most desirable for human beings? Is there anybody that's qualified to make those
Do
decisions?
we have, does sex have to be a certain pattern? I don't understand.
It has to be,
I
yeah.
don't know. He says it does. What do you think?
Because if, once they determine what's to be done in the future, the ideal society, they're
What
gonna
do
have
you
to do
mean? You
something.
mean, what do you mean? Like man on top, man on the female, on the bottom? What are you talking about? Sex
No, but
pattern?
they might decide the best pattern, and for some men, as the monks do, is celibacy for a certain length of time. It might, if they decide it increases their mental capabilities, I don't know what they're going to decide, this committee, right? What happens if they decide that? And John
Well, the
wants to
question that
decide
you
it?
brought up before, does a monk wake up with a piss hormone?
Yeah.
You know, what happens to that? You know, we don't know those things.
He goes
Or
to pee and then
some of
he's
us
done.
do. I mean, some of us have read books which give us some information along those lines. In other words, there's been very little surveys done in that area.
Well-
Does anybody know of any?
Well, you know, it's like this. I remember we talked about Tesla. He decided how much sex he had, I don't know. Never to get married, to have a minimal relationship with women. Whether he had it with men, I don't know. He said he had to do a certain amount of work, and to do that amount of work, he had to have a certain amount of energy with no distractions. That's the decision
Does
he
that
made.
make it so? Because he said
No,
that-
but he,
Or him.
but he decided to do it. And that's
He may
exactly.
have done that or he may not.
Yeah, I don't know. He may have just. That
We
book
don't know,
may-
though.
That book may be misleading,
Is
but
that about
I think-
Tesla or written by Tesla?
No,
It's about-
about that.
there's people.
Very difficult.
But let's say, but once your society makes the decision, they'll make a decision, the direction they're going. Then they will do just what Tesla did or somebody did. They'll say we have to suppress certain areas and do certain others. They can't just let anything go. I don't think
But
that,
also,
that
if
can be
you
possible.
if you have 1,000 things you like to do, you think about sex a lot less than you would do now, where you hang around here bored and you think, what can I do? I'll go to sleep, I'll find somebody to go to bed with. Or if I have a million things to do, and I do have a physiological urge,
I'm saying if you got a million things to
might
do and you're
go.
starving too, you'll never
Yeah,
think about it.
you might, you
But
know.
that's imposing a very unusual situation upon the subject. If you're saying the guy is exhausted, he's suffering from
not talking
tuberculosis,
about-
he's
I'm
got
not
two
talking
bad
about
legs, he's not going to think about it. No,
Well,
but the ordinary
anything-
healthy person was saying, who hasn't got so much on his mind, his courses, his this and that, he's going to think a lot about it.
Are there any other contributions anybody else wants to make to the discussion? Something about it? Joe, do you have any additional statements you want to make regarding these patterns? Well, let's start off and see what happens. Let's see what we've got there. Now you know how you sound on radio.
Was this broadcast on the radio?
Yeah, it went out to 10 million listeners.
Are you kidding? I want to erase my sexual attitudes. I don't want anybody to know about that. But we were advocating all that bestiality. That's not going out, is it? Because I have a reputation. Oh,
It wasn't being answered.
No, it wasn't being answered.
The whole thing was a silly
It's
story.
impossible.
Because you can't get on the air and discuss these things with anyone, because you're always dealing with personal values. You're not dealing with some direction that might be desirable. You know where they do that? It's how many men they put in a canoe in a raging river. How many men do you put in a canoe in a raging river? If you make a mistake, you make the mistake, and they determine the optimal amount of men in the canoe. That they don't do that with sex. They don't try to find out just what might be the
Yeah.
optimal condition for man. Not ask man what he thinks ought to be the optimal condition, because he's a product. It's like asking a Nazi what he thinks of that point of view, or an Orthodox Jew what they think of their particular religion, or a Catholic for that matter. It's very difficult to talk with people because they come from a particular persuasion. This is the problem.
That's right. You need a laboratory.
Control situation.
That's right. The problem is with the men in the canoe. You know what Marshall McLuhan said? He says pornography is only possible with a camera. That is, it's the picture that we're talking about. No. He says it came into being with there was obscenity before. That's related to
It
the
came
verbal
into being
lie.
with language, Alex.
No, that's obscenity. We're talking the pornography, and this man's the trial against this man is for pictures of incidents, and that's what McLuhan says. Pornography has to do with the invention of the camera,
Well, let me
motion
ask you a
pictures.
question. I remember some years ago at Sing Sing prison, they had a warden's party. Not a warden's party, but a lot of the prison guards came to a nightclub in which the sex act was performed live. Now, at that time, it was called a stag party. They had different terms for it. But don't you think that too is similar? Without pictures?
It's the same thing.
Yeah, but they don't bring them up on trial for pornography. It's something else. I forget what they used to call it. But it's the same thing. It's a different word. You're right.
But
Now, what
there are
about-
books that would pornography without pictures that are pretty pornographic.
No, they call that
The Richard
obscenity.
word.
They brought you up on obscenity. It's just a word, but it would never be a trial for pornography for a non-picture book. It'd be a trial on obscenity.
Have any of you guys ever observed some girl
The
that
same thing.
walked a particular way, not to turn guys
I
on,
call
but
that-
she naturally walks
That's
like
right.
that, without an act? Now, this particular girl, I remember, they told not to come to their church anymore. And every time she came down the aisle, it was natural. It was very that type of walk. And she was well shaped. And all the heads were turned. And the women used to feel that this girl was doing it deliberately. And they turned her out, and on the way out, she had an epileptic seizure. She was an epileptic, and she was very emotional about the situation. And she couldn't help. She always walked like that. Was anybody around, a cemetery, or any other place. But just exactly definitions of what desirable patterns are very confusing.
There is none.
Very tough.
Oh, you
There's
don't
no way you
know
got
what
to
I'm
control situation, Chuck, and you don't have control situation because everybody puts their 2 cents in with their prejudice and version.
talking about. Okay, let's see what we got here.
Yeah.
This guy that's being tried, which to me is so in Congress the whole damn thing, because Congress just, the Supreme Court just passed the damn thing. Now they're turning around and saying, no, now what do they mean? They just arrested another guy. What do they really mean?
The real misfortune is it gives it more importance than it deserves. I think they ignore all this stuff. Why spend millions of dollars
Have you
on
heard?
this
You
crap?
know what he said? He's got a backlog of orders right now.
That's right. I just told
A
you that the other day.
backlog of
That
orders.
guy, this was worth $100 million in
worth
the
of,
in the
he's got $1
thing.
million worth of back orders right now,
And
which
I
they
don't-
can't tell him he can't print because they're orders that they demand to be sent out by the dealers. And believe it or not, people are buying something.
And what he'll do, even if they stop him, he can open another company that somebody else has published. This could go on forever with this guy.
What is that?
Oh, there's a Tesla article in there.
Oh, is there one on Tesla?
Not the one you were talking about.
No, but
About
Tesla,
what?
John J. O'Neill quoted Tesla from his views on how he
Talk
thought
to
that his
Tesla.
work was more important than becoming involved with the male-female relationship. That
Was
is,
he asexual?
That's what O'Neill seems to indicate,
yes.
although. And he knew him. He knew
Yes,
him personally.
was. According to Tesla, yes. So he diminished all types of sexual contact with anybody.
You know what they call a person that falls in love with themselves?
He was, well,
Well,
that's
he
what he-
wasn't in love with himself. He felt that his work was the important thing in his life, and so he devoted all his energies to that.
Let me say something about that, John. It seems to me that when we get hunger is a physiological thing. Internal secretion does occur.
Sex actually
The existence of the
reverse.
testicles put certain tensions on a person. And no matter how much they work, the accumulation of certain internal secretions do occur. And like in children, they get erections and they're not after anything in particular.
Right.
Now, doing physical work, in some instances, increases the output of the interstitial glands. A person sometimes is able to perform sexually more so after physical activity. So that you cannot sublimate sight or hunger. You can stay it off, hold it back a while, but it isn't a thing that you
Well,
sublimate.
You can
Well,
sublimate sex, though, can't you?
Not really.
Yeah,
What
but
is
that's
that,
what
really?
the book-
Wouldn't that be
the
a
latest psychology book
let's
says
say as far as
You can't do it.
inhibiting,
They
let's say
can't.
a work
It
itself
diminishes if you
would
don't
be
do
so
it all the time.
stimulating than anything else. When you start exploring phenomena,
But
that-
you do stop and eat.
yes, you do.
Yeah, but
something.
that's a different kind of a
Sometimes.
need.
There's sometimes a person can go 4 or 5 days without eating because the work is so stimulating.
Yeah,
And this is the
or
thing.
let's assume that's so. But in eventually yield.
Eventually,
Well, if you go
But
to
sex
3
they
weeks
say
or 4
is-
weeks.
But
Okay.
according to,
Well,
you can live without.
Are there
sex, but
other
you can't live
manifestations?
you
without-
can live without sex very easily. Because we have done some research in school. We have just on the subject of sex, and he's brought up several different things.
Like what?
That they said that contrary to hunger and other biological needs, sex is not a necessity. And if you don't keep it up, and if you don't do it, and it doesn't bother you, like they say you need it and need it, it will the
That's-
drive will diminish,
That's
and it
the
will
old
actually
saying.
not.
If you don't lose it, you lose it.
Well, in
supposedly.
a sense, but in a sense, but it doesn't.
Never met anybody who lost it.
It does not need to be fulfilled, it will actually diminish the less you do
Well,
it.
what happens then with animals during the mating season?
Well, that's a
Well, why don't they
different
just
kind
go
of a
out and
thing,
eat
because-
berries and forget about that?
That's
Because it's a
different. There's all
chemical
factory
kind of a thing. It's a
stimulation,
completely
triggers
different
off chemical changes and
Okay.
so on.
But
And
you mean
that-
there's no intellectual stimulation?
No, not within an animal.
What happens with a human being asleep, getting an erection or having, you know,
There,
sexual...
all the defenses and barriers supposedly, we don't know what's occurring when we're asleep. Is
Well,
that-
what about children
Would be-
asleep
You
with
have
an
no
erection?
control
No, but that
either
is-
over
that is
sexual
different.
stimulation.
Huh?
It
If
doesn't
you
need to
live
be
in
a
an
person.
environment, if you live in an environment that offers just a little amount of sexual stimulation, you have no control over that per se.
Yeah.
You don't know what.
Well, did you ever get an erection in a bus, not thinking about
Yes,
sex as a
but-
kid?
Yes, but that has to
As
do
a
with the
kid,
vibratory rate and
Right,
so on.
Yeah.
right.
But
Does
you
that
don't jump
cause-
up and rape
does
somebody.
that direct your
at that time. Some
attention?
do.
Does that
Huh?
direct your attention sexually?
Sometimes it does and sometimes no. Sometimes you'll know the factors that bring it about, and you say, well, that's very interesting. Some people, I do now I do. Before I would have thought about going out and getting
That's what his girlfriend says, too. That
But
was
this only
extremely
happens
interesting,
when you're a
Jack.
kid, because there's a
Especially when
different
you're on
kind
a
of a
railroad,
reason.
a
But
railroad.
nowadays, when
And
you're an
I've
adult,
worked
it
on a
doesn't
train,
happen.
and I've worked on a train. I have never met so many horrid females in my life.
And it has
And
to
then I
do with
worked
the
on a train.
frequency of the
And
change.
I could find no explanation to that. And it seems to be related, maybe to the motion of the train.
It is.
Oh,
You're
it's
saying the
like
train is a
a-
place to be.
It is.
Situation too, you be on the train, it's a passing, you just meet somebody.
No,
passing.
sir,
It's a
I
combination of all
can't
those
accept that
things.
completely. I
It's a
can't accept that
combination,
completely.
Laura, of the motion of the train, the clickety-clack, there's a rhythm involved.
I'm getting excited.
Well, listen,
All the
John, I've been
specific
on the train many
experiences.
times, I cannot say the clickety-clack hurt me hard.
That's
Really.
that old song, the clickety
And I
clack.
have traveled extensively on trains. I cannot take
But that's
more
true, it's
money on
physical. I
trains
mean,
than I've.
I would
any
say
other
it's a
situation.
combination.
I think it's
of
a
all your
combination.
The point being is some
Yeah.
people ain't gonna be turned on, they do have a low sexual drive, whatever that means. And so we're using them as a basis for our argument. That's right. Some of these guys and women, I don't care
What do you think
if
of
you
this
try
theory
to
of
turn on.
sublimation? What do you think of it?
That
You
depends
can
on
shunt,
motivation.
you can shunt it, sure.
What did you say? It depends on the motivation? On if
Like what they call sublimation, where they say you can sublimate that behavior. There's some people that will pray or verbalize a great deal or jump
Yeah.
rope or get out and play football, take a cold shower.
Yeah.
That doesn't cause a seminal fluid to pass out, taking a cold shower.
no, but the values that they have been given, the concepts related to it, would cause them to go ahead and, in many cases, suppress or inhibit that
Sure.
type of sensation, because of certain, well, like I say, concepts that they have been given.
What about, let me ask you a question in relation to that. What about, for instance, let's say a female having a relationship with a male, being really disappointed, badly hurt, and having, like, I talk to females in that sense. I don't know if that is true or not, that's just what they told me, where they're saying that they were really badly disappointed by a guy, hurt because of a divorce or husband or something like that, where they found out something. And they said their sexual drive diminished, considered the opposite, that they just didn't feel like engaging in it.
Yeah, I've
You know
read
what I mean?
that. I've read that with men too.
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
inhibitory then,
Yeah.
because of past experience, because of pain.
Subversive stimuli.
Yeah.
This is similar.
Got
Just
them in
all those
trouble.
things are possible. And some people find it's just too much bother, too much hassle. Some people find it. And some people find, I don't know about, does anybody know about Thoreau's personal life in that area? Anybody here? Pretty
Same
hard.
with Leonardo da Vinci, there never seems to have been any women in his life.
Almost all biographies is that they,
Hardly anybody.
with well-known
Well, but
people,
others, yeah.
Einstein.
However, on the other side,
Yeah.
there was remember the Lives and Loves of Beethoven?
Freud did a long study on the
Yeah,
basis.
right.
You see, so
Well, but he's pretty
here you
accurate.
have
I think
a
his
high
idea
degree
is
of
that's what
activity.
we're talking about.
I think Oscar Wilde was very creative and very
We do
active.
different kind
And
of.
so was the beatster Aleister Crowley. He was considered by some in his time a genius, and he was sexually active and
Very active.
physically active in other areas. He was kind of a generally active person. And there are very few people that, the only person I've ever read about, I don't know if you remember this, Gandhi used to say that he was not very sexually driven when he was busy working, and he also ate very simply. But when he went to highly spiced foods and really lived it up, he said he found the other urges returning, that his sexual level dropped considerably when he abstained from very rich foods and ate simply and just lived quietly. Now, this is what he claims, Mahatma Gandhi. He said whenever he went back into the other system, he took on those patterns. That's why I say a lot of studies have to be done, since all of us here, I'm sure, are victims of the culture. And we speak as victims of culture. What do people talk about who come out of a concentration camp? Those subjects. And so here we are, victims of the culture, trying to talk about, people with pointed heads, who none of us have.
We always have to do as one blames Sigmund Freud, we just mentioned his name, for having certain problems that he analyzed in his own terms and thus, foisted off on everybody. And then we all have our own personal bent. An undersexed person says, well, it can be easily sublimated. An oversexed person says, impossible. You know what I mean?
Yeah, of course.
From his own physiology.
Yeah, but there's one area about Freud's work that's been completely overlooked, and that's the very beginning of the impressions that are formed upon a child, like I talked
Oh, no, I
about
think
where the
he's
family
accurate.
unit.
I think he's accurate.
I
think
agree
he's
too,
accurate.
but it's overlooked because they place most of the emphasis on the projections involved
Mhm.
and so on, especially in adults. And Freud traced it back
Yeah.
to the early
Right.
childhood
I
where
agree.
the impressions
I
came
agree.
from.
Oh, I think
And that's
he's accurate, but I'm saying
washed over in many
he's working
cases.
on his own system. Other psychiatrists, Jung took a little different point of view, given his background, given his family unit. You know what I mean? And
Well, let's talk about it at Chippy's.
yeah.
Chippy's
No,
open?
No,
no,
Chippy,
Sambo.
Chippy no open.
Oh,
Chambo.
Sambo's all right with you
Chambo.
guys?